Anita, let me know that all's good. So I'm going to go ahead. Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to pivot from what I thought I'll be initially speaking on. Overall, it's going to cover the same things, but it's going to cover a little more than just the stakeholder part, and you'll see why. So what I'll be speaking on today is being an effective product analyst and is being a great analyst enough. And I'm Tanya Tandon. To begin with, this is about me. Of course, to explain myself or to introduce myself, I had to use a Venn diagram because we are nerds like that. I love data science, I love adventure sports, and I love art. And I grew up to be that kid who loved card games and who used to count cards, um, who loved calculating probability in any board game I've ever played. And I play a lot of strategy board games, and I'm happy to have a conversation about that. But that's how I like to introduce myself. A little more about my education and my formal work. So I did my undergrad in statistics from a college in India called Kirodimal, Delhi University. And then I worked for a year in a consulting firm, which is a blockchain consulting firm. And I did a little bit of product management, a little bit of data science work. And I realized that I have a strong passion for data science. And I wanted to learn in depth about what tools to use and what are the best practices and everything within that. So I started my master's from Northwestern. I did Masters of Science in Analytics from Northwestern, and it was a really, really good experience. I think it's one of the best things I've ever done in my life because of multiple reasons, which is again a topic for another discussion. So I'd like to get into what I'm currently doing. So currently, as Anita mentioned, I am a product analyst at Pandora, where currently I own podcast, which means that I have certain stakeholders, which I'll be explaining in more depth further. But I have a lot of stakeholders that I work with in podcast, and every effect and every decision that are needed to be made in podcast sort of goes through me. So that is what I do. I also do other stuff, like I work on retention, I work on certain playlists and stuff like that, but podcast is my main focus. The other thing that I'm working on right now is a Delta Fellowship, um, where it's a consulting company, but for NGOs. So we built a machine learning solution for NGOs, and I'm volunteering here, and I'm helping a company called Tarjumli, which helps language solutions and helps refugees to overcome language barriers. So I'm working as an ML solution consultant for them. So those are the top two projects that I'm part of. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about my internship when I first started working at Pandora. And I think that in ways has transformed how I view my current job and how I approach my current job. So I think I'd like to begin by that. So during my internship, I was told that my problem for the summer is how does repetition affect our listener base? And this is a really broad problem, and it is a complicated problem because if you think about a music streaming service, repetition could be different in a lot of ways. It could be different for different genre, different music artists, different song. Repetition is also very different for a younger person than an older person. It can also be different state-wise and a lot of these things. So I did what an analyst would do when given with the problem. I inquired the problem. I met with a bunch of stakeholders. I inquired the problem. Then I built hypotheses on what to do about it. How do I define it? Because defining repetition in itself is a difficult problem. Third, I built a bunch of metrics and a bunch of proxies, because again, repetition is not something inherently measure in an app. So you have to build proxies for what is a good repeat, what is a bad repeat. So I built a bunch of that, and I had a solution, and I found something very interesting. I cannot really share what it was, but it was to contrast to what had originally been being used in Pandora, which really sparked my interest. And I met with a bunch of people, like I met with scientists, I met with product manager. So I don't know how it is for every other company, but for my company, and I think a variant of it would be true for other companies, is that we have a wiki page where everything, all the documentation of all the projects so far has happened. So I went there, I put repetition, and each and every one associated with repetition, I set up one-on-one time with them and I met with them. And what happened because of that was that I met a senior data scientist who was way above my area of work, but he was happy to meet me and he was happy to talk about my solution. And a happy outcome of that was that they actually changed the metric, how repetition was used in Pandora, and they put it to production. And I was still an intern, and my manager did not introduce me to that scientist, or there was no formal way of making this happen. The only reason it happened was because I actively talked to people because I wanted to understand better and learn better. So this I thought was really cool, and I realized very fast that as a product analyst, uh, your influence is like you have a problem, you build a solution, but how useful that solution is in some extent dependent on how good your solution is, but it's also to a great extent that a lot of oversee is dependent on how strong is your network. So that is where my motivations are coming from, and that is where I strongly believe that it is really important. But before talking more about how exactly everyone and anyone can approach it within their company, I wanted to tackle this question of what does it mean to be a product analyst? Now, I am assuming our audience is mostly product analysts or aspiring product analysts, or people who are who have been in product analyst for a lot of years. And I think everyone has different definitions for it. I went to school for data science. So when I thought about product analyst, to me, it meant building machine learning solutions, but being close to business and building machine learning solution and delivering it to business stakeholders. That's how I saw it. And what I think a lot of people define the difference between data science and product analyst is that product analyst, you'll be closer to the product, you'll do A/B experiments, you'll do reporting. I have also heard people think product analyst is just a data analyst. I've heard people say product analyst is just a business intelligence kind of person who's just gathering reports. So I've heard varying things about it, and I think this is an important distinction to understand what it really is. So in my experience, this is what I think the ideal way to define a product analyst's work is. So being a product analyst work, to me, in my experience, it's 20% strategy, 20% stakeholder relationship, 20% storytelling, and 40% analytics. So all the A/B experiment, building reports, doing R dashboards or doing Python dashboards or R notebooks, Python notebooks. Yes, it's a big chunk of our work, but I would say it's still 40% of our work, and rest 60% are all of these other things that we easily oversee. And the influence and importance of your 40% analytics sort of comes from how good you are at those 60% other things. And today I'm going to be covering very high level my thoughts as well as action items for each of these things. So first, I wanted to begin with strategy. And before we get into strategy, I think it's important to understand the distinction between reactive product analyst work and proactive product analyst work. Now, reactive product analyst work is anything that you're doing when you're reacting to a certain situation. That is, let's say coronavirus happened and you have a product, and now a product manager wants you to tell them what is the effect of coronavirus on your product. So that is reactive. Or you had a marketing campaign and you have to report on what was the success because of marketing campaigns. So that again is a reactive product analyst work. When we talk about proactive product analyst work, it's more active in nature, where let's say you are segmenting your customers. Uh, let's say you have ad revenue model and you're segmenting your customer for better ad targeting. Now that would be a proactive product analyst work, because you are trying to actively and proactively have better long-term results and make data-oriented choices. So it's very important to first understand what kind of product analyst are you? Are you a reactive product analyst? Are you a proactive product analyst? In my opinion and in my knowledge, no one is 100% reactive product analyst and no one is 100% proactive product analyst. It's always a combination, some ratio of both of those things. But I would advise that we should all, being product analysts, actively think about what this ratio should be and need to optimize on that, because I feel it's very easy to get carried over by only reactive work, because there's no escape from reactive work. Things will happen and you'll have to react to it, and you'll have to help people take decision when coronavirus comes up or when a marketing campaign happens. So you need to tell them what happened. But proactive work is also very important, especially for the long-term growth of a product. And which is why you should define first for yourself what you think the ratio should be. People own product in a different way. For example, in my company, we have a vertical setting where every product analyst own a product, and different product analysts don't work with each other. They work with PMs, but it could be different for your company. So that is a good point to begin with. Now, once you have thought about that, I would say the other action item would be you should talk to your stakeholders, and I'll come in a second about what these stakeholders are or what they should be or who they are. So you should talk to your stakeholders. It could be a manager, it could be a PM, whoever that is. So you need every quarter, when you plan what you will be doing, which I think you should, because there needs to be some planning that should be done before every quarter. You should commit to some hours for proactive product analyst work, and that will give you certain authorized work hours just to work proactively. And as a product analyst, it is your role to tell the product manager that this is really important. So this is a chance and this is a way to do it. Next, I think other thing to also remember is that stakeholders, your product managers, uh, the scientists that you work with, whoever you work with, they can tell you better about reactive work than they can about proactive opportunities. So you have to play a more active role in figuring out what these proactive opportunities need to be. And I think being more proactive adds a bigger value to the company long term. Although reactive work is very important, but a clear distinction should be made. Next, I wanted to talk about stakeholder relationship. Before getting into that, I wanted to stop a moment and think about what really are stakeholders. So stakeholders are anyone you work with, anyone who are your clients. Since we work in a product company, our clients are our product managers, engineers, scientists, and a lot of time people think product managers are the only stakeholder that are important to product analysts, but I would disagree. And I think depending on the structure of your company again, but I think partnering up with engineers and partnering up with scientists is also critical for your success, and you should view them as your stakeholders. So the first step of stakeholder relationship is identification, which is stage one. So firstly, you should identify all stakeholders. And as I mentioned before, your stakeholders are not just your product managers, they're also the engineers, they're also the scientists that you could potentially work with. So to give my example, for example, I work with podcasts. So for me, my stakeholders are people in the product who are building new features related to podcasts. So they are my stakeholders, and the content team in product is also my stakeholder. And people who are creating new content, the product managers for those are my stakeholders. In addition to that, the product managers who are partnering up with content, new content, third party content people are also my stakeholders. And apart from that, the scientists which are building recommendation system, which are actually put to production, meaning the things that you actually see in the app, would also be my stakeholders, because I can leverage that knowledge and do a business and drive a business decision. And that may be out of the purview of work that a scientist does, because a scientist, at least in my company, and that can heavily differ, but at least in my company, a scientist is one who drives production code, but and doesn't really need to translate that to business needs. But I can be the center point between scientists and uh, leadership and drive those decisions. So identifying all stakeholders is important. Identifying influential stakeholders is again important. And this might not come immediately. This will probably take some time, because as you spend more time in the company, you will realize that who are the influential stakeholders, and that can again be different, because again, as I spoke about podcast, it's a multifaceted product. Every product decision is driven by different people. So when I create a buy-in for a proactive product analyst work, I need to know which stakeholder should I be talking to, which PM or which engineer or which scientist should I be talking to drive that. Next, identifying peers is also important. So there are, I'm sure in all our companies, there are a lot of product analysts, but some product analysts will work in a product which is similar to yours. For example, mine is more content-centric product. Some people might have a more feature-centric product. So depending on what your product is, you should identify who in your team is more likely to have answers. And you can use them for peer review for anything that you build, or for developing best practices. Partnering up with peers is very important. There may be formal groups where people learn from each other, but even if they are not, you should take initiatives to make those groups. Now, action to connect. The way to go about this, there's no one right way to do it. This is how I do it, and this is how I think that should be the chronology of doing it. Is first, you should always introduce yourself, and you should set a one-on-one time with all of these stakeholders when you start with the company, or if you have ever always been in the company but you have not spoken one-on-one with a lot of stakeholders, you should, I encourage that, you should do that, and you should get to know what they really do. Again, your stakeholders are your clients, and if you don't know what your clients are doing, what problem they're solving, you can't really give them a solution. So you need to know what problem they are solving and what are top priorities for them and what are their needs and wishes. You need to know that about everyone that you think is an important stakeholder. And this is the only way you can add value to them. Another thing that I've not mentioned here that I actively do is whenever I am added to a meeting, and it could be something related or unrelated, whenever I'm added to a meeting, I always make sure I check up on who they are and what product division they work in and what exactly they do. And I do that using an internal Pandora tool, because we have this tool where you put employee's name and you get all the details, but it could be different for your company. But before going in a meeting, if you know who you're going to be talking to, that's going to add value and that's going to help you ask more relevant questions. So I would encourage you to do that. The third thing, which I think is the most critical, is you need to maintain relationship with all these stakeholders. Again, these are the things that have worked for me, and there's no one right answer for it, but these are good places to start. So the first thing I think we need to do is have data literacy. and provide all the stakeholders with details on what you do, and also build reporting cadence. Um, Other than that, whenever you build a solution, for example, for me, I build a dashboard for the effect of coronavirus on podcasts. I shared it widely with anyone and everyone remotely included with podcasts, because they were all very curious to see that. And we live in a very data centric, data influential world. If you see any kind of media reports in New York Times or any Washington Post or any place, you see that it's very data driven. Therefore, everyone's mindset has become more and more data driven. So the more data you provide them, the more they will feel confident in their choices, and the more stronger relationship you'll have with them, because they value data and you are closer to data. So I think we should use that as a superpower now that we have it, and we should help with data literacy. And a lot of time people don't even ask you that, can you share that report with me? I think as a product analyst, it is your job to identify who all can potentially leverage from this work that you have done. And if you're not sure, just share it. And um, coming back to my product analyst work that I did, like the podcast coronavirus work, I actually heard back more from people who I didn't think, or who didn't ask me for it, but they found it really useful. So you should do that. Next, this is something that has worked for me. It may or may not work for you depending on your project need or your company structure. But I have a lot of stakeholders that I work with, and I in particular have 3 PMs that I actively work with. So I've set up a bi-weekly meeting with all those stakeholders to discuss needs and wishes and bring them on the same page. Since my priority for each product and for product manager could be different, and this is a good way to bring them all on the same page, and a healthy way to make them realize that if I'm not responding very actively on a request, that's because I'm doing other things. And it's also a good place. As a product analyst, you're creating a space where all of these product managers that have a product in common find similarities and use the work that we have already done in some other way in their particular field of work. So that's something I do. You can do a variation of it or whatever you think works for you. The other thing is, again, my solution for what I do, and it could be different for you, but I use a Trello board, and I have 2 Trello boards currently. One where I list out all the products that I need to monitor, and all the projects that are high priority for me, and I rank them, and I set up timelines for it. And I have another Trello which is shared with all my stakeholders, where they can like put requests, like if they want a particular data set, or if they want some report, or if they want a long-term project. It's just a good, and this board is available to all, so they can also see what other people are doing. So, and I also update it every few weeks, so they know that what I'm up to every week. So this is something that has worked for me, and honestly, this can be an entire conversation on its own, how to best use Trello and which productivity tool to use. But in summary, you should explore productivity tools if you have not. They are a really good tool to bring everyone on the same page. Now, wanted to share a story, of course, an anecdote about how important storytelling is as a product analyst. The story I'm about to share is actually a non-Pandora story, but I thought I would change gears and share another interesting anecdote from my life. I when during my time at Northwestern, I and one more person, we participated in a Humana Maze healthcare competition, which is a big healthcare competition, and it was in 3 rounds, and there were 100 teams participating. And by the time of round 3, only 5 teams made it. And what we were supposed to do is we were supposed to build a machine learning solution for predicting likelihood of opioid addiction by looking at an individual's health insurance history. So when we were flown to Houston to present our findings, we did a very thorough analysis. It had everything. We built a machine learning solution. We thought about how to productionize it. We also built a front end machine learning solution for doctors to view a patient's history and also view in real time what the likelihood of individuals' opioid addiction is. We built all of these fancy stuff and we included all of that in our presentation. And the other thing, apart from all this analysis work that we included in our presentation, was that we started with the story about a person called Jane who has kids and who is 35 years old. She has this life and she gets opioid addicted and she loses her job. She is very suicidal now and all of those things. And then we went into machine learning solution. And then when we finally presented all our findings, we talked about how Jane can leverage from this solution. And if Jane's doctor knew that she could potentially have a opioid addiction, he would not have prescribed her opioids to begin with. And that would have helped so many Janes like that. And we were really happy about what we had presented. But what came next was a little shocking. So after we had presented this, and we presented to Chief Digital Officer of Humana, and when we went to her for feedback, she said that the thing she liked most about our presentation was that how we personalized the opioid addiction problem and we introduced the character of Jane. And that is what she liked most about our presentation. And honestly, that took least amount of work. And that would be the last thing I would think would be most important to leadership. But apparently it was the most important thing to leadership of how we view that problem as a machine learning consultant. And we ended up winning second prize in that competition and winning $15,000. So that was really a pivotal point where I realized that stories matter a lot, especially when you're selling your machine learning solution, or especially when you're talking about your machine learning solution, because that's the only way for leadership to actually understand how the solution will actually work and who will it actually impact. So always include stories when you are presenting your machine learning solutions or any kind of metric update, or always use use cases, a lot of use cases. So that is another thing I wanted to highlight. I wanted to end with this note because I think this is what I've learned so far. So Henry Ford, who built Ford cars, said if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, because they did not know cars could exist. We are so much closer to data than product managers or leadership that sometimes we know that cars can exist, but leadership doesn't know. So we need to be the people that tell them that when they tell us to build faster horses, we tell them, no, we can build cars, and that's a better way to go ahead. Which is why I want all of us, the last takeaway from this slide to be that we have data superpower, and it's a big superpower, and we need to think about cars and not faster horses. Thank you. You can contact with me on LinkedIn, or you can write me an email, and that can open up for more questions, because I talked a lot about a lot of things, but a lot of these things were open-ended, and it could be different for your company. So feel free to ask me questions on what could work in your scenario.
So Tanya, thank you very much for your speech. It was quite interesting, and I just start with my questions, and then I continue with questions from Q&A session. So. Sure. You have a great quote in the end of your presentation, and if you're like proactive analyst and you want to do research, for example, and your stakeholders like don't know nothing about it, so maybe you can give like some advice how to do the job to um, so this job will not be wasteful. Like, so how can we manage to, I don't know, like to good
Right.
yeah, to good conclusions and to good insights. How can we understand that this will be valuable for our stakeholders?
Right. That's a good question. I have faced that in my work experience that when I get asked to build something, but I am not sure if it will be useful or not. So I think the first step before you build anything, it could be a dashboard, it could be a report, it could be like anything, any analysis or customer segmentation, or no matter what it is, before you actually go ahead and build it, you should at least develop some kind of documentation on what are your expectations from this particular thing that you're building and what are the use cases. Like, let's say you do a customer segmentation table, but if it is not directly usable, then all the work that you put into it will not be useful. So you want to consider use cases as to exactly which team, and the more specific you can get about it, the better it is. Like, which team could potentially use it, like list out all the use cases and then go ahead and build something. Building and then thinking about how you can use it is, I don't think, a good way to do things. And then once you've identified that, okay, I'm building this thing for this team or this solution, go ahead and talk to them. Like, is this what you're thinking? So a product analyst role is also a lot of talking, that we don't we don't recognize it as a role that has a lot of talking, but it actually does if you want to do it well. So I think that's all I have to say about that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and one question from Pavel. On your opinion, what is the difference between a product analyst and data scientist? So yeah, you have quite a big experience. So
In my experience, so I went to school for data science, and I am currently a product analyst. And now, and to do both of those things, I would say they're very broad. It could be very different for every company. For example, a product analyst could be a data scientist in other companies. Like in Facebook, I've heard that product analysts are called data scientists in product. You can be a data analyst and do what product analysts do. So the terms are very fluid. But if I talk about high level, what I have experienced in my past and how I distinguish between the two is, at least in Pandora, data scientists are the one that build production code. For example, if you're on a music streaming platform and you listen to a music, then which other music should they show you, like B, C, D, E, which one? And all the production recommendation system are built by data scientists, whereas product analysts think more about which feature makes sense, which kind of content makes sense. For example, for podcast, which kind of content works better in which kind of demographic. So all of those problems. So I would think data science is more machine learning solution focused in production and focused in research, whereas product analyst is someone who's closer to business, who's constantly trying to optimize for more revenue, better customer experience. Depending on your product field, it could be more revenue, it could be better experience. Like, for example, I'm constantly working towards optimizing metrics in like better listening hours. So that is what I'm optimizing on, but every product analyst is doing it differently. So when you look at a job posting, or when you look at someone's title, you should you'll have to talk to them, because for every company it looks different. But this is what high level it would be.
yeah, and probably one last question from me. When you did like a big research and you mentioned like machine learning algorithms and so on, so how not to dig deep into research and spend like a lot of time on it, and like the question where to stop? how much time do you usually spend on this? Or maybe you can tell us.
I think again it's a very subjective question. It really depends on what your timeline is. There's a popular quote that says that work expands and takes the amount of time you have. So you should really set it. This is what works for me, and it may or may not work for you. But I always set timelines. So let's say it's an 8-week project. So I will give 2 weeks for planning and talking to all the stakeholders, give another 5 weeks for actually building the model, and the last 1 week for actually compiling all my findings, documenting everything. And this is for a machine learning solution. For a product analyst solution, I need to talk more to other stakeholders, so it could look different. But before starting any projects, I think you should answer how much time do I have, and what are the tasks that I need to do to achieve this, and set up a formal timeline for what should have been done by week 1, week 2, week 3, instead of having an open timeline of I will take as much time as it takes. So having a fixed timeline, and you could be a little flexible with that, but still following it to some extent would really help. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'm just curious, maybe can you tell us more about just a little bit, what tools do you use for a job when you're as a product analyst?
At Pandora in particular, I use a lot of Presto, a lot of Hadoop. Sometimes I use Python, but I didn't say it's a lot. It would be 30%. I use all the Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google presentation stuff. So data science tool would be Presto, Hadoop, and Python.